Yeah,
Estamos en vivo.
We're live. Excellent. Ulises.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Buenas tardes. Me da mucho gusto darles la bienvenida a esta conferencia, parte del cuarto encuentro presencial de la Maestría en Políticas Públicas Comparadas, donde hoy tenemos el privilegio de tener con nosotros al doctor Gary King y a la doctora Gloria del Castillo, quien nos brindará unas palabras al inicio de esta conferencia. Los presentaré de manera muy breve a ambos. La doctora Gloria del Castillo es directora general de FLACSO México desde 2018, doctora en Ciencias Sociales con maestría en Ciencia Política y licenciada en Ciencias Sociales por el ITAM. Sus principales líneas de investigación son políticas públicas y educación superior. Para presentar al doctor Gary King, me voy a permitir hacer una frase. Hace ya algunos años alguien dijo, si he llegado a ver más lejos que otros es porque me subí a hombros de gigantes. Quien dijo esa frase fue Isaac Newton. No seré jamás ni la milésima parte de lo que fue Newton, pero he tenido el privilegio de aprender de los escritos del doctor Gary King. Para ver más lejos que otros hay que subirse, sin duda, a los hombros de gigantes. El doctor Gary King es Albert J. Weatherhead III University Professor en la Universidad de Harvard, uno de los 25 profesores más distinguidos de la facultad y actual director del Instituto para las Ciencias Sociales Cuantitativas. El doctor King ha desarrollado y aplicado métodos empíricos en muchas áreas de las ciencias sociales, centrándose en innovaciones, ampliando los aspectos de las aplicaciones de la teoría estadística hacia cuestiones muy prácticas en el análisis de ciencias sociales y políticas públicas. Les doy la bienvenida a ambos y nos sentimos privilegiados de estar aquí con ustedes. Adelante.
Bueno, pues inicio, ¿verdad? Bueno, pues.
Por favor.
Buenas tardes a todas y todos los que nos acompañan desde la FLACSO México y a todas las personas que se han conectado a este gran evento. Saludo con todo aprecio al doctor Gary King, al mismo tiempo que agradezco que haya aceptado dar esta conferencia a nuestros estudiantes de la Maestría en Políticas Públicas Comparadas y al todo el público que nos acompaña desde distintos lugares. Saludo al doctor Ulises Flores, coordinador de la Maestría en Políticas Públicas. Gracias por sumarse a esta gran apuesta institucional. Igualmente saludo al doctor Raúl Pacheco, profesor adscrito al Laboratorio de Métodos. Hoy quiero compartirles que es un día de festejo, de celebración para la FLACSO México por varios motivos. Tenemos el gusto y el privilegio de contar con los conocimientos y experiencia del doctor Gary King, uno de los expertos más rigurosos, más reconocidos en el campo de los métodos cuantitativos aplicados a las ciencias sociales. Muchas gracias, Gary. Su participación se da en el marco de lo que en la FLACSO México hemos asumido como el debate renovado e innovador de las ciencias sociales, que consiste en la revisión crítica y constructiva de las teorías y métodos para avanzar en la producción rigurosa de conocimiento para la comprensión y mitigación de problemas y males públicos. Ahora sí, que la manera de operacionalizar este gran proyecto institucional ha sido a través de la Cátedra FLACSO México. En este 2023, el Laboratorio de Métodos tuvo la gran iniciativa de organizar una serie de conferencias, las Fronteras de la Investigación en México, al cual se ha sumado en esta ocasión la Maestría en Políticas Públicas Comparadas, gracias a la iniciativa de su coordinador. La conferencia del doctor Gary King, Métodos Cuantitativos para la Comparación de Políticas Públicas, y además tiene un subtítulo, digamos, que es la inferencia causal, abona un gran debate al mismo tiempo que aporta rigurosidad en el análisis de política pública. Uno de los aspectos más debatidos y discutidos en el campo de política pública tiene que ver con el tema de la causalidad. En este sentido, los aportes del doctor Gary King son de gran valía para nuestros estudiantes de la maestría en políticas públicas y comparadas y para toda la comunidad científica de América Latina y México, dedicada a la investigación en el campo de las ciencias sociales y, por supuesto, al análisis de política pública. Consideramos que la mejora en la solución de grandes problemas públicos guarda una estrecha relación con la comparación de políticas públicas. Grandes interrogantes como por qué algunas políticas funcionan en un lugar, país y no en otros, siguen en nuestras agendas de investigación. Los métodos al respecto son de gran valía para sumar respuestas rigurosas y efectivas a la mitigación de problemas públicos que impactan negativamente a nuestras sociedades. Confiamos en que en esta conferencia se brinden nuevas luces a quienes hoy se están formando como analistas de políticas públicas y que además buscan especializarse en análisis comparados. El mundo de hoy enfrenta una multitud de desafíos complejos que van desde el cambio climático, pobreza, desigualdades, exclusiones, etc. El análisis de políticas públicas permite a los investigadores comprender la compleja interacción entre varios factores que contribuyen a estos desafíos. Sabemos que no es lineal. Al examinar las distintas dimensiones sociales, económicas, políticas y ambientales, los analistas de políticas pueden identificar las causas subyacentes, anticipar las consecuencias potenciales y proponer intervenciones de política pública efectiva. Uno de los objetivos de la maestría en políticas públicas ha sido precisamente formar analistas y profesionales de las políticas con sólidas bases metodológicas. Un eje de formación estratégico justamente es el metodológico y el análisis comparado. Hoy, en la maestría en políticas públicas comparadas, se están formando tomadoras y tomadores de decisiones en distintos ámbitos y niveles. La toma de decisiones informada es fundamental para una gobernanza efectiva y el análisis de políticas públicas proporciona las herramientas y metodologías necesarias para generar evidencia. La investigación rigurosa y el análisis permiten a los formuladores de políticas públicas evaluar las políticas existentes, explorar soluciones alternativas y especialmente esperamos predecir resultados potenciales. Al basarse en ideas impulsadas por datos, los formuladores de políticas públicas pueden tomar decisiones, o al menos eso esperamos, informadas que maximicen el bienestar social, promuevan la equidad y aborden las diversas necesidades de las comunidades. Hace más de 18 años, ese fue el objetivo que pensamos, diseñar un programa que siente las bases de competencias necesarias para los profesionales en la función pública, pero también en otros ámbitos de la vida social. La FLACSO México elaboró una propuesta innovadora centrada en una modalidad semipresencial, cuyo fin es ofrecer una formación de excelencia a profesionales de diversos sectores que están en activo en diversas instancias de gobierno dentro y fuera del país. Tras los impactos de distinta naturaleza de la pandemia, no nos cabe la menor duda de que vamos por un camino correcto en términos de las líneas de formación e investigación de la FLACSO México. Hoy nos vemos honrados en contar con la presencia del doctor Gary King. Quiero reiterar que es uno de los expertos en metodologías de las ciencias sociales a nivel mundial, una gran referencia para todas y todos quienes nos hemos formado en el campo de las ciencias sociales, y hoy ha sido muy gentil en compartir su experiencia y sus recientes investigaciones. Esperamos que no sea la primera de muchas ocasiones en que nos acompañes, Gary, y como te decía Raúl al principio, que puedas acompañarnos de manera presencial. El mejor de los éxitos para todas y todos el día de hoy, y muchas gracias por su atención.
Adelante, doctor Gary King, lo escuchamos.
Great. Well, it's an honor to be here. I'm really thrilled to be able to be with you. I wish I could actually also be with you, but it's very nice. Thank you very much, Gloria. Thank you, Ulysses, and thank you, Catalina, who will be my voice during this talk. I'm going to talk about matching methods for observational and experimental causal inference. So observational is when you have a data set and you haven't created that yourself. You may have collected it, but you basically observe. Experimental is when we can randomly assign things. And I'll talk about seguro popular towards the end. But we'll use very similar methods to analyze both. In these, there's some readings, if you like, after the talk. You don't need to go read them right now. There's matching and causal inference, a particular method of causal inference, coarsened exact matching, that will be very easy to use and very, very powerful, and will save you lots of time. And then also articles on matching in experiments, including seguro popular. Okay, so what is the point of matching? The point of matching is to reduce model dependence. So let me explain to you what model dependence is. So here's a little figure. On the horizontal axis, I'm going to have years of education, and on the vertical axis, we'll have some outcome variable. It's hypothetical data, so I didn't even say what the outcome variable is. We have some treated units and some control units. So we can imagine that we're mainly interested in the people or the countries or whatever it is that receive some treatment, some program or whatever, some public policy program, and the controls are the ones who did not. We want to know what the effect of that is controlling for education. So how might we do that? Well, we might run a regression where the outcome variable would be where the outcome variable would be regressed, let's say, on a dichotomous variable of T versus C, and a control variable, education. And this is what it would look like if you actually ran a regression in these data right here. And what it shows is that if you go from C, which is in blue, up to T, which is in red on average, you go from this line to this line. Okay, everybody can see my my cursor here. Somebody us in the room. Yeah. Okay, great. But now if I could be sarcastic a little, let's suppose that our hypothesis was not that the treatment effect would increase the outcome. Suppose our hypothesis is that the treatment effect would decrease the outcome instead of increase, but our evidence is that it would increase the outcome. What's a social scientist to do, right? Well, we could look at the data and we could say, oh, you know, the linear regression doesn't fit so well, so maybe we should run a regression of the outcome on the dichotomous variable and education, and maybe education squared. And that'll fit better. And that, you know, you can see it, it's on the screen now. And now instead of the blue line being the starting point and the red being the result, we start with the blue curve and go down to the red. So now we've switched the result. We can get any result we want by messing with the specification. So you know, of course, that when you have observational data and you change the results, you change the specification a little bit here and there, that can have a big effect on the outcome. And if you can't defend yourself, if you can't make the changes based upon features that you can defend or which are empirically justifiable, then how are you supposed to know what the effect is? Is the effect positive or is the effect negative? How could you possibly know? That's model dependence. We want to get rid of model dependence, not because we're going to cheat, but the other guy might cheat. right? If you read an article and you suspect there's model dependence, how are you supposed to interpret the results, right? The conclusions, they're not going to be very interesting, and they're not going to be justified. And the empirical conclusions may just be the person's hypothesis, and that's not really science. So what do you do? What do you do? How are we going to reduce model dependence? Matching will reduce model dependence. I'll tell you what matching is, but for the moment, think of matching as what I think matching should have been called, which is pruning, like pruning away some of the data set. I'll tell you how matching will work later, but right now we're going to prune these observations because we'll run an algorithm that I'll describe later, and it will select some observations to delete that won't cause selection bias, but will reduce model dependence. So if I delete those observations, the ones that gray out, I'm left with this data set. I have this data set. I run the regression again, a linear regression of outcome on the dichotomous variable and education. And now the difference between the blue line and the red line is almost zero. Okay, everybody see that, right? But now we want to look at model dependence. What happens if we run the regression with education squared and we see how much does it change? I don't even need to click because the quadratic equation is plotted on the same plot already. Actually, what's happening is, whether it's linear or quadratic, we're getting almost the same line. So there's no dependence on the model. This particular specification that you choose for your regression doesn't really matter. You get the same answer. So matching reduced model dependence. That's the idea of this graph. So now we just have to figure out what matching is because it's going to solve a big problem for us. Okay. So without matching, we have imbalance between the treated and control groups. And when you run a regression, that's what it does, is it controls for the difference between the treated and control groups. If you give the medicine to the healthy people, and then you look to see whether the medicine had an effect, you could be tricked into thinking that the medicine actually had an effect when it didn't. So imbalance is what we have to worry about. Without matching, there can be imbalance between the treated group and the control group. Imbalance produces model dependence, produces different results dependent upon different specifications. Model dependence leads to researcher discretion, right? Not you, but the other guy, right? They can choose among the different models and produce any outcome they want. That's no good. That leads to bias, and we have to avoid bias. So interestingly, a qualitative choice by human beings from a whole set of unbiased estimates is or produces a biased estimate. Suppose we had 50 pure randomized experiments where there was no measurement error, no missing data, everything was perfect. But then the only difference is the human being gets to choose which of the 50 results they want to present. That's bias. If instead we choose the one that we decide on the basis of theory is more plausible, that's probably worse. That's no good. Okay, wait a minute. Suppose we try really hard to avoid bias. We just try hard. Well, as Majrin Banaji has shown, conscientious effort to avoid biases doesn't avoid biases if you're doing it entirely qualitatively. Okay, so why is that? The reason why is because people don't have access to their own mental processes as to when they're being biased and when they're not being biased, because they don't have feedback telling them when they're biased, so it's not possible to learn. Okay, you might say, what if instead we had an expert like you, all of us here, we're all experts, we've been studying this stuff. What if we have an expert? Well, as Phil Tetlock has shown, experts overestimate their ability to control their personal biases more than non-experts, and the most prominent experts, that's probably the guy who gets to give the talk, right, are the most overconfident. So that's no good. Okay, one last step. Suppose we understand the biases, we become experts, we teach the experts ourselves about these problems. We teach them and we explain to them that they have to avoid the biases. Well, as Nobel Prize winning psychologist Danny Kahneman said, quote, teaching psychology in this regard anyway is mostly a waste of time. So you can't teach people to not be biased. What you need is a systematic quantitative method that will avoid the bias. Matching is such a method. With matching, you get rid of imbalance. Once you have gotten rid of imbalance, you get rid of model dependence, researcher discretion, and bias. And in fact, a central project of statistics is to sort of automate quite a lot of human discretion so that we don't find ourselves biasing our results. And that's what matching will help you do. It will be very easy. You'll all be able to do it. It will improve your work. If you're going to run an experiment, you get to get out of graduate school earlier. You get to spend less money, or with the same amount of money, you get more secure and certain results. So what the heck is matching? What is matching? Let's set it up this way. We have a dependent variable, which is y. We have a key treatment variable that we want to know the effect of, and it's, for simplicity, we're going to make it dichotomous. Of course, in practice, we can make it more complicated, but just for simplicity and for expository reasons, so I can explain it to you relatively easily, we'll make it dichotomous. And we'll have a whole bunch of pre-treatment confounders, things that come prior to the treatment and cause imbalance between the treated and control groups, and those are X. Then we're going to focus on the treatment effect for a particular observation, observation I, and we're going to imagine it had received treatment. So it was assigned to the treatment group somehow. What is it that we want to know? What we want to know is the treatment effect, TE, treatment effect, for observation I. And the treatment effect is the causal effect for that one person of the difference in the outcome variable if that person had received treatment minus if that person had not received treatment. So these are called potential outcomes. The first one is observed, because I already said right at the beginning that it's a treatment effect for treated observation I. And the second one is unobserved. Since the first one's observed, we can get rid of that notation there. And so we have an observed outcome because the person received treatment. And all we need to know is what the value of the outcome would have been had that person not received the job training program or whatever the treatment was. We need to know the difference between those two. And so all we need to do in matching is figure out what this value is, which is unobserved. Obviously, we can only see the outcome variable under treatment or not under treatment, right? Because each person either gets one or the other. They can't get both, right? But we are imagining they would have hypothetically gotten both, and we want to know what the difference is. So how are we going to estimate y of 0? We're going to estimate it with another observation from the control group, that is a group of people that did not receive treatment, and we're going to look for somebody who has the same values of the control variables as this treated unit, but only it has and then we're going to use the outcome variable for that person to substitute in there. So that's going to be the way that we're going to estimate it, and that's the fundamental intuition behind matching. We're going to fill in the unobserved potential outcome, which is what would have happened if that person did not receive treatment, from another observation among the group of observations that had not received treatment, who look very much like this same person. And look very much like is going to be defined in exactly this way. That is, they're going to have the same values of the observed covariates. So that means, of course, that we need to select the observed covariates carefully. We need to have the right variables. And if you select the right variables, then you can do this procedure, and you can get rid of a lot of model dependence. Okay, so under this, of course, we're not going to try to make an inference for every one person. We're going to take the average. So this is the mean or the average of all the treatment effects, and that's going to be called the sample average treatment effect on the treated. Sometimes we also delete units in which we can't find a good match, right? So we just call it a feasible sample average treatment effect on the treated. This whole procedure is a tremendous convenience in statistical analysis because you can think of matching as a pre-processing step. So if you had not come to this talk, you would know how to analyze data, but you might have model dependence. What we're going to suggest is you do whatever you were going to do previously, except you precede what you were going to do with matching. So you pre-process the data with matching And what does that do? It prunes away some of the observations. You take the rest and you do whatever you were going to do previously, and all the statistical methods and properties will follow. So you prune the non-matches, which I still have to show you exactly how the matching will work, but we're going to prune away the non-matches, and that's going to make the control variables, the X's, matter a lot less. That will reduce imbalance, reduce model dependence, reduce researcher discretion, and reduce bias. You're going to get the right answer. It's going to be a lot easier, cheaper, and more powerful. Okay. I think of matching as finding hidden experiments, hidden randomized experiments inside observational data. Since we're going to think of it that way, we need to think about types of experiments, because it turns out there's different types. Let me just tell you about two types. The first one is complete randomization. For each person, imagine each person in the room there, we flip one coin. If it comes up heads, you get the treatment. If it comes up tails, you don't. So you do it for the first person, then you do it for the second person, and you do it for the third person, and you keep going. That's the classic experimental design. It's called complete randomization. A second method, called the fully blocked experiment, works by first matching, okay? And we're going to think of this in a special case of a fully blocked experiment called a matched pair experiment. So what we're going to do is we're going to first pair up everybody in the room. We're going to take all the people that are men and match them to men, and women and match them to women, but on all the other characteristics also, and try to match them as close as possible in pairs, right, from where you're from and all the other, as many variables as we can. And then we're going to flip, instead of one coin for each person, we're going to flip one coin for each pair. And if it's heads, the first person gets treatment and the second control. And if it's tails, the second person gets treatment and the first person gets control. So that's a matched pair or fully blocked experiment. Turns out that's way better than complete randomization. So let me explain why. The goal of matching is to balance the covariates, to make the treatment group and the control group as similar as possible on the pretreatment covariates, the X's. There are observed variables and there are unobserved variables, the ones you didn't think to measure. Complete randomization balances the observed variables on average, because you get into the treatment group or the control group by a coin flip. So on average, you're going to be, the two groups are going to be the same, both for the observed variables and the unobserved variables. So that's really great. That's the advantage of an experiment. On average, the treatment group and the control group are going to be the same. In your one experiment, though, could be off because you're flipping coins. It could just be the case that all the men wind up in one group and all the women wind up in the other group. That's a small probability if you have a big enough N, but there's extra variability in there. What does a matched pair or fully blocked experiment do? It matches exactly on the observed characteristic, exactly, because you do that first before you flip a coin. And then when you flip a coin within the pairs, you still get to match on average all the variables you didn't think to measure. So which is better? The better one is the fully blocked or matched pair experiment. It's in mathematics or statistics, we say it dominates complete randomization. It's better than. It's better than complete randomization for imbalance. It has lower, a matched pair experiment has lower imbalance, less model dependence, more power, more efficiency, less bias, fewer research costs for the same standard errors or confidence intervals, more robustness. In fact, in this article, we show, my two co-authors and former students of mine and I show that your standard errors can be 6 times smaller if you just choose, if you're going to run an experiment, to run a fully blocked or matched pair experiment rather than a complete randomization experiment. 600% smaller. That's a big deal. Okay. That when we ran the Seguro-Popular experiment, we saved Mexico millions and millions and millions of pesos and got a much more secure and certain answer by using this experiment. We developed it for Mexico, actually. So the goal of each matching method, now I'm going to switch to observational data, and we'll come back to Seguro-Popular at the end, is there's a bunch of different matching methods, and I'm going to describe them to you. One, probably the most popular one, should not be used. It is a mistake, and we've proven that recently it was a mistake. Propensity score matching approximates complete randomization. it approximates the worst of the two experiments. It's still, that's still okay, but it would be better to approximate the other one. Pretty much all of the other matching methods approximate a fully blocked experiment. All the other matching methods are better than PSM. They dominate PSM. But actually, it gets worse for propensity score matching, which I will explain. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through three methods: Mahalanobis distance matching, coarsened exact matching, which I recommend to you, and propensity score matching, to give you a good feel now for how these methods prune away some of the data. Okay. So first, Mahalanobis distance matching. It approximates a fully blocked experiment, just as we would want. The idea of it is you pre-process the data with matching, throw away, prune some of the data, and then you do estimation as you may have otherwise with a difference in means or some model. You need to measure the distance between the treated and control units to figure out which ones match. So it's going to use this method of distance, this metric for distance, which is known as the Mahalanobis distance. But as a side point, I'll mention that Mahalanobis is pretty much only made for methodologists. We really use Euclidean distance, which just deletes this one little piece in the middle and lets you choose the scale of the variables based upon how important they are. I'll leave that as a side point. Once you have the distance metric, you match each treated unit to the nearest control unit. The control units are not reused. You can and you prune them if they're unused. It's like musical chairs. Whoever doesn't get a chair, you just delete those units. And then there's one more step. Any distance between the treated and control units that are larger than some value, which we call a caliper, you just delete those. Okay. There's a lot of adjustments to how you use this metric. There's all kinds of different ways of applying the Mahalanobis distance metric of matching, but this is the basic intuition, and the differences among them don't matter for this purpose. Okay, let me give you a visual version of this whole thing. Okay, let's suppose there's some outcome variable, and we have two background covariates, age and education. So neither is a dependent variable. They're both X's. There's age and there's education. There's some treated units and there's some control units. And what we're going to do is take the distance between each treated unit and find the nearest control. So that's what this is. But by that metric, by that little bit of math that I showed you on the previous page, these are the closest T's, closest C to each T. See that? Those are the closest ones. Okay. You can only match each one once, so maybe this T, it would be nice to match here, but then you couldn't match this one to this one, et cetera. So this is collectively the best matches. Then we take all the others, which I'm graying out, as you could see, and you delete them because they didn't get matched. So like in musical chairs, they get to be deleted. You drop the particular link, and this is your new data set. If you use this data set rather than the original one, that's the original one. If you use this data set, you'll have less model dependence. Okay, let me give you the best case to give you a better feel for it. So this is Mahalanobis distance matching again, but in this case, for each treated unit, each red T, right, it is right on top of a C. So that's terrific, right? Because you're going to exactly match there, right? And you can prune all the others, see? So every treated unit and every control unit matches exactly. And then if this is your data set, you can control for age and education squared and the interaction between age and education, and it won't matter. The estimates will all be the same. The effect of those control variables will all be zero. You can add age squared, age cubed, age to the fourth times education. It won't matter, right? Because you will not be able to predict a difference between a treated and control unit because all the differences are zero. So this will eliminate model dependence. So that's a good case for Mahalanobis distance matching. If that distance metric makes sense to you, such as if your covariates are pretty much all continuous, then this is a great method. Let me give you a better method for most of us, which is coarsened exact matching. It's the most powerful, easiest to use approach. It also approximates the fully blocked or the better, like match pair experiment. Again, we pre-process the data and then do estimation after we've pre-processed the data by pruning some data. Let me tell you how we measure the distance. first of all, we're going to take every X and we're going to coarsen it as much as you're willing. Coarsen it. What does that mean? So for education, suppose we have years of education. We can take years of education and perhaps we might conclude that really the only points that really matter are degrees, grade school, high school, college, graduate school, etc. And if that's the case, then we can coarsen the variable. We don't care about 6 years of education or 7 years of education. We just care about these cut points. If you do that, then it's easier to match, of course, if you're willing to do that. So then you apply the method of exact matching to the coarsened X, which I'm going to call C of X. Or equivalently, you sort observation into strata, each with unique values of the coarsened X, and you prune any of the stratum without both a treated and a control group. If they have either 0 treated or 0 control groups, you just throw them away. That's how you do it. And then you pass on the original uncoarsened values of the units that you have. There's a little weighting to do that I can show you in a picture. So let me show you a picture. Again, we have age and education as two covariates. There's treated and control units. We have to figure out how close each treated unit is to a control unit. Okay, so to do that, we're first going to coarsen. To coarsen in this case, I'm going to use the humor from my co-author, who you can see age here. He has these silly categories. Retirement sort of makes sense. Don't trust anyone over 30. Drinking age. I'm sure none of these matter for you guys, right? For my graduate students, the funniest thing is high school, BA, MA, PhD, and then I tell them second PhD, and they go, "Whoa, hold on a second." In any event, that's a joke. You would pick the relevant breakpoints, and from those breakpoints, you would draw these bins. And some of the bins have both treated and control units. Some of the bins only have either controls or treated, but not both. The ones that don't have both get pruned. Everybody see that? The ones that don't have both get pruned. That's the idea. So if they're in the same bin, they're close enough. If they're not in the same bin, we drop them. That's the idea of coarsened exact matching. The great thing about this is that I think everybody understands what coarsening means, right? We do it all the time in data analysis. Okay. There's one more step, which is you start here and you see in this bin, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Cs, 5 control units and 1 treated unit. So you have to sort of weight them so they're the same. And so just visually, I made it so the Cs are smaller and they add up to the T. And similarly, this one you don't have to weight because there's only 1 T and 1 T, so they're 1 C and 1 T, so they're equal. But anyway, that's roughly how you do it. Then you can throw away the bins. That's your data set. If you use this data set rather than the original data set, you will have much less model dependence, more efficiency, much less bias. So this is the method I'm going to recommend to you. The best case in coarsened exact matching, again, we have a data set where there's almost exact matches. You see there's a very fine grid over here, so you didn't coarsen very much at all. We drop the ones that are that don't match. This is our data set. No matter how you control for education or age squared, whatever it is, it's not going to matter because you're not going to be able to predict the difference between treated and control. And so that's great. Okay, last method, propensity score matching. I wouldn't even present this to you except that it has been used a lot in the literature, and I think people have not really understood what it did. And if you use matching, people may ask you about it, so I want you to know about it, but I don't want you to use it. Okay, and the reason why is because it approximates a randomized experiment, a completely randomized experiment, not a matched pair experiment. Okay, so we pre-process the data and we do estimation just as before, but here's how you create the distance metric. First, we run a logit regression of T. We have no outcome variable here, but this is not the substantive outcome variable, but the idea here is you start by running a logit regression of treated versus control as a function of the covariance. So this is a logit regression. Then you take the predicted values from that regression for every treated unit and every control unit, and just take the absolute value of the difference between them. That's your distance. Okay? You match each treated unit to each control unit. The control units aren't reused. This is the same as before. Many adjustments available to this basic method, but the main thing that we're doing is we're taking the big multidimensional X's and we're squashing it down to one dimension. And on that one dimension, we're looking for differences. So let me show you this same picture of education and age. Now we're going to use propensity score matching. How are we going to do that? Propensity score matching is not on that plot. It's off the plot, right? It's the probability of receiving treatment. I'm going to take each of those points and I'm going to put them over on the right, because each of those points has a probability of treatment. And then I'm going to put the data aside. I only have this one dimension. I'm going to match each treated unit to the nearest control on that dimension, not the original data dimension. Anything that doesn't match gets dropped just as before, but only on this dimension. Then you throw them back, you project them back into the space. Okay. So that's the idea. I think you should have the intuition that some information is lost because we're doing it in one dimension rather than two, or if you had 10 explanatory variables rather than 10-dimensional space. This is easiest to see in the best case of propensity score matching. This is a wonderful data set, just like the other two that I showed you, where each treated unit is right on top of a control unit. It should be wonderful. It should be beautiful. Now, let's suppose that in the best case, all of those control and treated units project to 1 point on the propensity score. So they match exactly on the propensity score. What happens? What happens is that you have to, they're all the same, right? All the treated units and the control units are all the same. The distances between every treated unit and every control unit is exactly the same. So if you have to prune, what do you use? Well, which ones do you prune? It doesn't matter. So you prune at random. Pruning at random is actually bad, because when we prune this data set, this T is not exactly on the C. Some are close, some are far, right? So propensity score matching is suboptimal. It will match at random for times. Okay, let me give you a page of its properties. It has low standards because it's trying to approximate complete randomization rather than a fully blocked experiment. It sometimes helps, but it never optimizes. It's efficient relative to complete randomization, but it's inefficient relative to full blocking. Other methods are usually better. If you exactly match on the X's, then you also exactly match on the propensity scores. But if you're using propensity score matching and you begin by matching on the propensity scores, you don't exactly match on the X's. So you don't necessarily get what you want. It's not a good practice. It turns out it gets worse than that. Let me show you this crazy thing. We call it the propensity score paradox. And the idea is when you do better, you actually do worse. So I'll explain what I mean. All right, first piece of background. Random matching increases imbalance. Let me give you two pieces of intuition. Think of the classroom. Look at how close you are to the nearest person. Now let's imagine that I randomly selected half of you just by flipping coins. And if anybody got heads, we sent them out of the room. Now think of how close you would be to the nearest person. You'd be farther away. Random matching increases imbalance. Here's another even simpler case. Suppose my covariates are thumb and forefinger, and I have treated unit, and we have treated units and control units. Right now I have one thumb and one forefinger in each group. They match exactly. Now think of different ways of pruning the data set, of dropping 2 units. We could drop 2 thumbs and then we get 2 forefingers. We could drop 2 forefingers and we get 2 thumbs. Those match exactly. But there's 2 other ways of matching. We could have a forefinger and a thumb, so then it doesn't match exactly, or a thumb and a forefinger, and it doesn't match exactly. So if you match at random, we're going to select 2 of those 4 half the time, and half the time, random matching is going to increase imbalance. You don't want to match at random. When propensity score matching approximates complete randomization, what is it doing? What it does is it matches at random. That's no good. Since all of the pies are about the same, they're all about 0.5. You can only prune on the basis of the 0.5. So you're basically pruning at random. Pruning at random produces more imbalance The point of the method is to reduce imbalance, but this increases imbalance. Imbalance produces inefficiency. Inefficiency produces model dependence. Model dependence produces bias. If the data have no good matches, the paradox won't be a problem, but you're cooked anyway. It's no good anyway. I'll skip that. Okay. Actually, I'm going to skip this too. Okay. So propensity score matching is blind where others can see. Let me show you this idea here. I made a fake data set. All right. First, I make a matched pair data set. These blue observations are really wonderful. Every C is very close to on top of a T. That's the data set you'd want if you were running an experiment. I then created a matched, instead of a matched pair data set like over here, I created a completely randomized data set. The T's are not always close to the individual C's here, but you can see overall the T's and the C's are roughly the same. On average, these are the same, but at an individual local level, they're not as good as here. So this is great. This is good. And then just to mess things up, like many of our observational data sets, I threw in a whole bunch of controls. Okay, so a typical observational data set would have all this thrown together, and we would hope that there would be a wonderful matched. We would hope that there would be a wonderful pristine experiment hidden inside our observational data set. So if you're given this, obviously without the colors, we would love to pull this out. Okay, what happens if we use the different methods? So let me show you Mahalanobis distance matching and then propensity score matching. I created this data set 1,000 times, but they all give similar answers. So we're going to look along this axis. What we do is we drop the worst observation first. How do we drop the worst observation, the worst match in the entire data set? Well, it's probably something like the distance between this C and maybe that T or something, or this T or something like that. So along the horizontal axis here, if we go from left to right, we're going to prune things in the color of the different observations here. So what happens? According to Mahalanobis, it prunes the C's, just as you would want. It makes sense. And then it prunes the really bad matches. Then it prunes the good ones, and then it starts pruning these. So it's just what you would want. First these, and then these. So what does propensity score matching do? Remember what I said, propensity score matching approximates a completely randomized experiment. It doesn't see, understand, or perceive a fully blocked experiment. It's not good enough to do that. So what does it do? Well, it first peels off all of the really bad matches, just as it should. That's why these are all black. And then what? And then it can't distinguish between the great ones and the good ones. And you get this all this modeled stuff between the two. Okay, let's skip that. Now let me show you the same idea, but give you a little more feel for it by creating an outcome variable. So far in this talk, we haven't even had one outcome variable, except the hypothetical one at the beginning. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take a data set. I am going to have an outcome variable created by a treatment variable, a causal effect of size 2. So I'm going to call it 2, and then 2 control variables, x1 and x2, and they're going to and with some normal random error. So this is my setup. Okay, I'm going to start with the original data set. The original data set is right down here before there's any matching at all, and then I'm going to run not the true regression, which is down here, but I'm going to run a whole lot of regressions. All the regressions will have T in it because I'm trying to estimate the causal effect, which is the effect of T. But they're going to have model dependence, lots and lots of models. So one of them may be the true model with x1 and x2, but another one will have x1 only. Another one will have x2 only. Another one will have x1 squared. And another one will have x2 squared, and another one will have x1 squared, x2 squared, and x1 times x2. I'll make 50 different models like that. For every one of the models, I'm going to calculate the coefficient. I'm going to run the regression and calculate the coefficient on T. When I do that, I'm going to get a different number. across the 50 models, I'm going to get different numbers. The more variability there are across those different specifications, the more model dependence. So that's the vertical axis here. Model dependence is bad. So up is bad. So I'm going to take those 50 results and I'm going to calculate the variance, and I'm going to be right here. Now I'm going to do the same thing after matching. Now, how am I going to match? What I'm going to do is I'm going to match the worst I'm going to prune the worst observation, then do the whole calculation again, then prune the next worst observation, run the whole calculation again, prune the next worst observation, and run the whole calculation again. If you look at MDM, which is Mahalanobis distance matching, it's exactly what you would expect and what you would want, which is, as we prune more observations, as we go to the right here, we're pruning more observations, the variance across the models, the level of model dependence declines. It goes down, 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 and it basically becomes zero. What happens to propensity score matching? Not that. At the beginning, it's quite good. It goes down just like Mahalanobis distance, just like Mahalanobis distance matching does. And then it gets to the point where it can't see the difference between complete randomization and a fully blocked experiment. And what happens as you prune more? As you prune more, model dependence increases. You're throwing away observations and you're paying a price for that. I mean, we already pay a price for throwing away observations because our confidence intervals get bigger. We're willing to do that in the usual case because we're compensated because model dependence decreases. But propensity score matching makes you pay a price for things to be worse. That's no good. Okay. In addition to showing model dependence, now I know what the truth is. It's 2. So I put 2 is right here on the horizontal axis. And I run the same experiment, but now I'm going to calculate the bias, which is the distance from 2. Or I'm actually going to calculate the coefficient. So we start here for Mahalanobis distance, and we get closer and closer to 2. And eventually it gets down to 2. Okay. What happens with propensity score matching? Gets closer and closer to 2. And then when it can't see the difference between the good and the great data set, it starts to get worse and worse and worse and worse. It's crazy. It's like you go into a shoe store and you give them money, expecting them to give you shoes, and they say, no, no, give me your shoes. You have to give them the money and your shoes. It doesn't make any sense. Okay, so I've given you hypothetical data. How about real data? We replicated this article in the Journal of Politics and this one in the American Journal of Political Science. And this again is the number of units pruned. The vertical axis is the amount of imbalance. That's the raw data. For CEM and Mahalanobis distance, the more you prune, the lower the imbalance, just as you would expect. Even over here, the more you prune, the lower the imbalance. I also did it for random, completely random pruning, which doesn't make any sense, and it goes up like this. What happens with propensity score matching? It's pretty close to random matching, right? Because you start with raw, and then imbalance goes up, and then it keeps going up and up and up and up and up. It's nuts, okay? You don't want to use this method. In fact, early on, we didn't really understand what we were doing. We didn't understand the methods, and so we thought, let's get a whole bunch of data sets. And so we advertised on the web. We said, anybody that wants help with matching, just send us your data set. We won't publish it. We won't scoop you. We won't tell anybody that you gave it to us, but we'll get experience in using the data sets. We'll analyze it and give you, you can use our analysis methods. We found the same pattern in 20 other data sets. This is a general phenomenon. Don't use propensity score matching. Okay. So let me switch now for a few more minutes and talk about experimental uses of matching. In particular, I'm going to talk about the Seguro Popular experiment that I was privileged enough to be part of. Maybe you know the history of this, but Julio Frank and Vicente Fox asked, how can one democratically elected government tie the hands of their successors, right? Their goal was to keep Seguro Popular in place for as long as possible. And so their thought was, let's commission an independent evaluation. Let's get some Harvard professor. We'll put him in charge of it. This guy that doesn't really even speak Spanish, but maybe people will trust him. And like in science, if you make yourself vulnerable to being proven wrong, and it turns out you're not wrong, then people will really trust you. That was the idea here. If if they show Seguro Popular is a success in this evaluation, it would be hard to eliminate the program. And if Seguro Popular is a failure, then who cares about extending it? They were true believers in Seguro Popular. So, of course, I asked them like 35 times. I said, if I find this program doesn't have an effect, I'm going to tell everybody that, right? And they said, yeah, we're spending so much money on this. We really want to know. And of course, if you write a contract and you say Gary can run any experiment he wants, we ran the largest health policy experiment in the history of the world, and one of the largest policy experiments to date anywhere either. It had 148 geographic areas, 500,000 people. It was a big experiment. Okay, let me give you the overall design. We took health clusters, which was every household and the distance between the household and how long it took to get to a health facility, and we tiled the whole country in these health clusters. We persuaded 13 of the 31 Mexican states to participate. So there was about 7,000 of the health clusters left. We did matched pairs, but we matched the clusters, the health clusters, in pairs based upon all the background characteristics we could find. This was a matched pair experiment. We selected 74 of the pairs. Some of them, it was just not politically possible to include in the experiment. Others it was. Of course, we wanted the pairs with the closest match because that would be make the most powerful experiment. We then had the pair and we flipped one coin for the two. We randomly assigned one of the two to receive encouragement to affiliate to Seguro Popular. We built health facilities. They brought drugs in. They brought doctors in. The federal government gave enough money to the states to get up to speed to be able to service all these people. It was a big intervention. We then conducted a baseline survey of each health cluster's of the facility itself. We did a survey of 32,000 people randomly selected at baseline, and then 10 months later to see what the outcome was. The cool thing about this experiment is that it's triply robust. Okay, let me tell you what that means. So first of all, the design has three parts. We did this matched pairs experiment. First, we matched the pairs, then we randomized. We randomized within pairs, one coin for the two. If necessary, we statistically adjust the differences at the end. So it has those three steps. And the cool triple robustness property is we only had to get one of the three right and we would be okay. If the matching was right, but we messed up the randomization or like we said, we flipped coins and we said this one was going to get it, but the government, secretly switched or something like that. It was okay. If the statistical analysis was right, but the other two was wrong, we would still eliminate the bias. So it has a triple robustness property, which is very, very important if you're going to run experiments in public policy, because politics has a big effect on policy. You really have to pay very close attention to that. When after 2 years of negotiation with the Mexican government, they finally signed all the contracts and said that we would be in control of the thing, we had done all of this literature review and studied every prior large-scale public policy experiment. And the first thing I learned is that almost all of them failed. Almost all the previous experiments failed. Why is that? Well, because the politicians would often intervene right in the middle. They would in Oportunidades, which is the anti-poverty program that came before Seguro Popular, and it was also a big evaluation, maybe not as big, but pretty big. The governors of some of the states where people were in the control group and didn't receive the program miraculously found enough money to give the program to the people in those states. Well, that's very nice for the people. And in a democracy, that's allowed to happen, but it completely ruined that part of the experiment. So you have to prepare if you're designing experiments for governments in democracies, or maybe not even only democracies, but anywhere where politics can intervene, you have to be sensitive to that. So our triply robust experiment was designed to be robust to the politics also. We even had 2 additional checks if the triple robustness failed, if we messed up all 3 of those. One of them is if we ran the effect of the program on the time 0 survey, right? Before the program was implemented, we looked at the effect of the program on the survey before anything happened. If the true effect we know was 0, if we found something that wasn't 0, then we would know something else was wrong. And finally, if we lost one of the pairs, then we could check for selection bias by rerunning this check. Okay, so one more page. Don't use propensity score matching. If you never heard of it and you don't remember it, no problem. It approximates complete but not fully blocked experiments. It ignores information, exacerbates model dependence. Instead, I recommend this simple and very powerful method called CEM. You go to garyking.org/CEM, and there's software for almost every framework you want. You want Stata or R or SPSS or SAS or whatever you want. I think it's all there. And finally, a lot of the same intuition and basically the same methods can be used with experiments also. I mentioned at the beginning that we saved Mexico millions and millions of pesos just because we used a matched pair experiment rather than a completely randomized experiment. Okay, so for more information and articles and software, lots and lots of things that we've written on it and presentations, you can go to my website, garyking.org, and I would be honored to take any questions you might have.
Ulises creo que hará las preguntas, ¿verdad?
Let's see, while you're preparing, I see there's one question about coarsened exact matching that I could just answer. I could give it a try from Alexandra. Alexandra says, I feel coarsened exact matching is heavily dependent on the size of the grids, on the type of coarsening. What is the best way to define the grid limits? Is it better to have bigger grids or smaller grids? Is it always subjectively defined by the researcher? So I'll give you two choices. One is if you want it to be automatically defined, our software will do that for you. The second answer is I would do it subjectively by the researcher, because you actually know things. And the more you take your knowledge, your qualitative, detailed knowledge of what's going on, and put it into the software, into the program, into the statistical method, the better we're going to do. I think that's actually by far and away the best thing to do. For example, let's take a third year, somebody who went to college for 3 years and then dropped out, compared to somebody who graduated and went to graduate school. Okay, that's a pretty big difference, even though the difference in number of years of education is almost the same, right? A first-year graduate student from a third-year college dropout, that's a really big difference. But if instead you coarsen and you say it's really degrees, and one person didn't receive the degree and the second one did, substantively, that seems very important. Now, that difference, that distinction that I'm making might not be the case in some applications, but I think you would know the best as to whether it is. And you could defend it also. So, would you like me to answer the English ones, or I can answer the Spanish. Sorry, I could answer the Spanish ones, but I don't know whether I would be answering.
Yes, I think they should go through the interpreter, but Yeah, we can do the English ones if you want. Sure, go ahead, please.
Okay. Do you, Fausto says, do you perceive a marked trend towards using more experiments in public policy, a trend towards behavioral public policies? Yes, absolutely. We did the Seguro Popular experiment almost 10, 15 years ago. That was very unusual back then. We had to convince the government. It was a really big deal. And then we had to convince Harvard that we were allowed to do this kind of research. I mean, it was, and then, you know, Mexico had to convince the Mexican people that this was okay. It was very unusual. Nowadays, actually, more and more governments understand that this is important. The phrase that I use, what I use to convince governments is I say, a big public policy program, you know what that is? It's a giant experiment with no control group, which means you may have a big effect, but we're not going to have any idea what the effect is. So people are more and more understanding that, and the cause of that, the reason why we're able to do that more often is you guys. It's you. Why is that? Because we train more and more people, and many of them go into governments or talk to governments or influence governments or citizens and ask their public officials about these things, and more everyone learns. Yes.
There's a couple more in English, I think.
Here. So,
adelante. Bueno, hay una pregunta que estaba antes en español, que es ¿qué tamaño de muestra es recomendable en experimentos de este tipo?
The recommended size of experiments. So my recommendation would be to run the smallest experiment necessary to get the answer that you need, because we are imposing on the people that we're studying. We're putting some people in the control group when we think the program may be powerful, effective, and useful for people. We don't want people to be over-surveyed, over experimented on. We want to do it when necessary. And there are ways of running experiments, for example, sequentially. So you keep collecting observations and you stop when you have enough information to make a decision. That's what I would do. I would do every public policy that's possible. I would integrate into an experiment, every single one. But the moment that you understand what's going on, there's no reason to experiment anymore. Mr. or Mrs. Anonymous attendee says, what if the matching reduces observations significantly? That's an excellent question. Obviously, if we prune away all the observations, there's nothing to study at all. It may be the case that all the observations should be pruned, and you should not ask the question if there's so much model dependence that there isn't any answer that you could have. But you absolutely do need to pay attention to both imbalance and the number of observations. There's a paper that I wrote with Rich Nielsen, who is a former student of mine and now a professor at MIT. And we show how to optimize for imbalance and the number of observations all at the same time. It's the matching frontier paper.
A ver, vamos a ver. Dice Arturo, es que se va. ¿Cómo, dice Tamara, cómo controlaron los aspectos éticos para la selección de los controles y los tratamientos, no solo en la parte técnica, sino en la parte política, en el caso de la evaluación del Seguro Popular?
Excellent question. I mean, if we don't get that right, we either don't get to run the experiment we care about, or we will never be able to run another experiment again. So we want to run the experiment on the smallest number of people possible, in the shortest amount of time possible. But if we don't run an experiment and we just implement the program, we may be wasting enormous amounts of money from the Mexican people and accomplishing nothing. So it absolutely makes sense to do an evaluation And I think everybody understood that. And we needed to do it in a way that was maximally respectful to the people that we were studying. Also, although let me say this in the worst ethical way, and then in what we actually did. So we randomly selected which communities in Mexico. In my office, I digitally flipped coins, and I decided which communities in Mexico would receive hospitals and which ones wouldn't. Well, that sounds nuts, right? That sounds unethical. However, it was going to be the case that the Mexican government was going to have to choose some communities to build the hospitals and build the health facilities. How was that choice going to be made? Option one is we can run an experiment and learn from it. And so whoever got it second and whoever wound up in the control group in our experiment wound up being in the treatment later. So option one is you learn, the society learns, and over time the program gets better and better. Option two is you say, it's not ethical to do the experiment. We'll just choose the order in which the communities get the program on the basis of something else. Well, I would say, what else? Some guy in a basement making a convenient choice and giving up the possibility of learning. And that's probably the best case without the experiment. What would really happen is politics would intervene and politicians would push for their people, and it would be the most powerful that would get the program. And the idea of the program was to help the least powerful. It was to help the poor people. So that's how we dealt with the ethical issues. But it's absolutely essential. The ethical issues and the political issues are integrally tied together. And unless we, as the scholars that come along and help governments do these things, pay attention to exactly your question, we'll never be able to really make progress or make a contribution.
Tenemos una pregunta aquí en el auditorio. Adelante.
Hola, buena tarde. Mi pregunta es sobre los estudios que utilizaron el Propensity Score Matching. ¿Qué hacer con esas investigaciones? ¿Hay alguna opción matemática, alguna interpretación que se pueda hacer considerando las diferencias gráficas o las metodologías que muestran ventajas como el Mahalanobis o el Corset Set Matching? Es decir, se pueden reinterpretar.
Go ahead. Sorry, so is your question which or when we use them? Is that what you mean?
La pregunta es, no, la pregunta es las investigaciones que ocuparon la aleatorización, la del propensity, que recomienda usted no utilizar por las desventajas señaladas. Ese tipo de investigaciones o de estudios que ahora con el conocimiento de las ventajas de otras técnicas, que se puede hacer algo, alguna operación o cómo deben de reinterpretar esas investigaciones que tienen ese sesgo que ocuparon la aleatorización.
I see. Good question. I think that creates tremendous opportunities for you all to go get the data from those studies and replicate them with a better statistical method. You might learn some really important things that would be valuable to publish, and we would all learn from it. So yes, we could do much better. I think that's right.
Hay una pregunta en inglés en el chat que dice, is it advisable to use matching methods in situations in which only covariates at higher levels given a multi-level structure can be observed?
Let's see. Sorry, is it this one? Can you use it with hierarchical models? Is that the question?
Sí.
Yes. Okay. Yes, you absolutely can. there's a few things your question may mean. So let me answer them in a couple of ways. One is after you do matching, you can use whatever statistical method you want. If you prefer to use or find a good reason to use hierarchical models, then you can use hierarchical models after you've done matching to reduce model dependence. Hierarchical models involve very complicated or sophisticated, very sophisticated statistical techniques. There's a wide range of them. What we don't want is very different answers when you choose among the different methods of hierarchical data analysis. And if you do matching ahead of time, it will help a lot. So.
Ok, hay otra pregunta. Dice, en un país donde existiera un problema de credencialización, es decir, donde el nivel de educación tuviera un sesgo de medición, ¿qué podríamos hacer al considerar el nivel educativo como parte del apareamiento de casos y controles?
Good question. Okay, so your question is measurement error. So if you need to control for a variable that has measurement error, what do we do about that? So that's interesting. Let's suppose in the best case, the measurement error is we don't know exactly the number of years of education, for example, but we do know whether they got a degree, right? In that case, coarsening would not only help in the way that we do with CEM, because it would make for more matches, but it would reduce the measurement error. It would eliminate, I mean, if we knew in the best case, if we knew the degrees exactly, but the years of education not exactly, it would eliminate the measurement error. So sometimes it can help a lot. Of course, if your data is completely junk, then you're going to get junk out the other end. But paying attention to the data generation process and where the information is can often help a lot.
Dice, ¿cuál es el lapso de tiempo recomendable como mínimo y máximo para elaborar un experimento de análisis de políticas públicas con el método MDM?
So we did, in our experiment for Seguro Popular, we did a baseline survey. We then implemented the program and waited 10 months and did another survey. We would have rather done more follow-ups and waited longer. Do you know why we waited 10 months? The reason why is because the election was coming. And one of the requirements of the whole program was we needed an answer before the election came. So, it may not have been the scientifically best choice, but it was the practical choice, because if we didn't do it, then we may never have been able to do it. So we learned some things we could learn at 10 months, but we didn't learn the things we might learn at 2 years. To me, let me go one more step. We did a 10-month experiment. The best thing would not only have been to wait, the best thing would have been to evaluate on one day, right? Because our experiment was set up in the best way that we were able to convince everybody to do it. But what it basically meant was there was going to be one day after we worked on this for years at which we announced whether the program was a success or failure. A much better way to do it is to experiment in very short intervals of time, so that we implement today, we evaluate tomorrow, and we change the program the next day, and then we evaluate the next day, and we adjust the program the next day. And then you learn. Think about diving practice in the Olympics. Okay, what happens is somebody goes and does a dive, the coach says, move your toe, right? Go do it again. And they go do it again, and they do it again. And every single time the coach provides feedback. What would happen if the coach just sat there and watched, and at the end of the practice session patted you on the back and said, good job, and that's it, and went home? You wouldn't learn anything really, right? So what we want is to be able to build ourselves into the program so that we can influence the program all along the way. That's not always politically feasible. It's not always the best thing to do from a political point of view, because you don't want the evaluators to be captured by the program. There has to be a little bit of distance. But conceptually, that minimum time I'd want to be really short.
¿Alguien más? Son hasta el momento todas las preguntas que tenemos tanto aquí en el auditorio como en el chat. Profe Raúl, adelante.
Gracias, profe. Pues básicamente creo que ha sido una experiencia extraordinaria el escuchar a Gary, y sobre todo creo yo que para nuestros estudiantes del programa de la maestría en políticas públicas comparadas, es importante ver cómo la investigación científica, la investigación de ciencias sociales que se hace en la FLACSO de tan alto nivel, tiene también aplicaciones en la vida real. Este tipo de programas como el que presentó el profe King ha sido también motivo de tesis y de análisis ahí mismo al seno de la maestría, lo cual creo que demuestra también el nivel del posgrado y del programa que tenemos. Y a nombre de la Cátedra FLACSO México, quisiera también agradecer del Laboratorio Métodos y de la Cátedra FLACSO México de este año. Quisiera agradecer tanto a Gary por la conferencia como a la maestría en políticas públicas comparadas por todo el apoyo colaborativo con el que contamos para esta conferencia. Nos solicitan de parte de comunicación que nos quedemos unos 5 minutitos después de que se transmita la conferencia para tomar la fotografía de todos. Entonces les pediría que a quienes están en el panel, Alicia, Gloria, que prendieran que prendieran su cámara. Mande, profe.
Sí, ¿no? Aquí donde